Minimalists.
Are there ways to transform vacant malls into something valuable for the community?
Yes, and I think we should.
Yeah.
And so before I get into my pithy answer here, I want to talk about this because we have some spaces. Now, we're seeing this happen now, and this is a better use than just leaving it sit there decaying and rotting, although I think sometimes that's beautiful. I love looking at Detroit at its sort of bottom, which was somewhere around, I don't know, 2010,
God, dude, like
2009.
The malls, the libraries. Yeah, there's some
yeah,
really
the schools, the libraries.
beautiful things. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yeah. In fact, Sean, there's a photo essay. I don't remember if it was in Slate or New York Times, but it was somewhere. The photo essay of New York, of Detroit rather, from about a decade ago, and it's stunning. And there's something stunning about that decay. But we do want to reuse many of these spaces we can. Now, a lot of these malls are being bought by Amazon, and they're being turned into distribution centers. Now, there's a good reason for them to do it, and it's actually better for the environment if they do it, because a few things. One is they don't have to build a whole new space.
Yeah.
They get to reuse this space, which is better than if they were to build something right next to it, right?
Right.
But also, it's right next to the highway, so they don't have to drive 15, 20 minutes off of the highway, which uses more fuel, it produces more carbon dioxide, etc. And so it's better for the environment overall. However, I think there are so many other better uses. That's one use, and if that's going to work, then great. I know they're buying up a lot of malls and turning them into distribution centers. I would love to see, it's my great hope that we could see a giant dent get put into the homeless crisis by reappropriating malls.
It's a great idea.
Into homeless centers with services and testing and medical services and food and sleeping quarters as a transitionary space back to non-homeless life, right?
Yeah.
And because I mean, I have so much compassion. When there's such a problem here, especially in Southern California. I think about a fourth. I think it's a fourth of the homeless population in the country is in California.
Yeah.
In one state.
It's crazy.
And so there's a large homeless problem here, and I think that we could address it by using some of these empty spaces that are not ever going to come back.
Right.
And that's the thing we have to recognize. This is fluid, as I talked about earlier. We built these things to think they would be permanent. And they could be permanent structures, but the use is not going to be permanent.
Right.
And so I think we can transform them. I also think that we are missing out a little bit on community space because these were the one benefit of the malls. You remember when we were teens? We would go hang out at malls all the time.
Yeah.
I'd go to the Middletown Mall. Me and my brother went there like several times a week.
Yeah. We used to go all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I spent a lot of time. And now if you look at the Middletown Mall, you got to see the video. I mean, it's terrifying, man. Ryan managed a store in Middletown. It's in between Cincinnati and Dayton, Middletown. And so I think you have to look and say, what is the best use of these spaces? Can they be transformed into experience spaces? I think in some cases, yes. Can they become more town squares? Yes. Our friend Rob Bell, who's been on the podcast a couple times, we've been on his podcast, the Robcast. He's written 10 books, but before he moved to California, he was a mega church pastor. His church was in a mall, an old donated mall. And so like it was an abandoned mall that they donated him in, I think, 98 maybe. And so there are a lot of things we can do with these spaces that are shockingly more intentional than
consumerism.
Yeah, than the shopping mall itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so here's my pithy answer for you. Almost anything is more valuable than consumerism. And so I wrote this other thing down here. I don't know if it's a minimal maxim or not. Abandoned malls are consumerism at its terminus, an empty carapace brimming with nostalgia, not meaning. And I think there's something about that. When Ryan, in the Dayton Arcade, so you and I we're finishing up this new film with Matt D'Avella called Less Is Now. Yeah. And part of it surrounds, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes of it now is around this talk that you and I went out and gave a bunch of times. We only use a few excerpts from that talk at this point, but we wanted to give that talk originally in an abandoned mall.
Right.
We just found that it was going to be really difficult, but we finally found one. We found the Dayton Arcade in downtown Dayton proper, and it's this beautiful abandoned structure. It's been abandoned, I think, since '89.
Beautiful decaying mall.
Yes, yeah. And there's something just gorgeous about it. In fact, we had secured it. We took 2 trips out there. We did some filming inside it. We were getting ready to film the talk, and then they found all this asbestos.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, we can't have a whole crew of people here exposed to asbestos for 12 or 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
That's 30 years from now they'll have mesothelioma. It would not be a good thing.
Yeah.
And so we had to let that go, even though it was gorgeous. Although I think parts of that will still make it into the film itself. There were other malls that we wanted to use. We went and actually toured some other abandoned malls. It just didn't work aesthetically because they weren't decaying yet, so it just looked weird. It looked like it looked like someone had closed the mall for us to film in it, and it didn't work. But we ended up finding a better space anyway, so it worked out really well. And I also wrote about the Dayton Arcade in our next book, Love People Use Things, and it got cut somewhere between the 3rd and the 4th draft, that section did. So I think I'm going to read it on the Maximal episode, because there's this whole metaphor about abandoned malls and how we've abandoned ourselves.
I'm really excited for the renovation of the Dayton Arcade.
Yes, well, let's talk about how they're going to use it, because
Sure,
I think
go for it.
that perfectly addresses Anka's question here. You've been there. So talk about the space, what it looked like.
It looks post-apocalyptic. It's got like escalators that are decaying and these high ceilings that are glass with, I guess, wire or copper like framing, and again, looks post-apocalyptic. Old stores where you could tell it was like a sneaker store because you can just barely see half of a sign that you can make out the word sneaker.
Yeah.
A lot of old abandoned office spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's truly beautiful, but it's weird though because we keep calling these decaying malls beautiful. It's beautiful for the wrong reasons though.
Yeah, well, I think the thing about the Dayton Arcade, and we'll go into this more on the Maximal, is it wasn't originally a mall. It was a community space.
Yeah,
and it was actually built way before malls were ever even invented.
Right.
It was an indoor and outdoor community space. It was a market. There were offices there. There were apartments. It was this shared living space, and eventually, consumerism took over.
Greed took over.
Yes. But now here's the thing: it is being repurposed. It's being reclaimed. And because the architecture is some of the most stunning architecture I've ever seen.
Absolutely.
Go ahead and Google Dayton Arcade, or we'll put a link to their website in the show notes. Yeah. But it's amazing what they're doing. But they're turning it into a co-working space. There are going to be some shops in there, but it's not going to be retail centric. It's going to be like a market,
community centric. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a technology lab that's going in there from the University of Dayton.
Wow.
Apartments, people, they're going to use it as a community space again. Yeah. And part of that does involve consuming, but it doesn't involve consumerism.
Right.
And I think we need to make that distinction. And so I think the Dayton Arcade is actually the best example of what we can do when we take a structure and we repurpose it in a way that is better for the community and doesn't encourage us to overindulge or to overconsume.
Yeah. When I read this question, it made me think about reusing things in general, and I think it's always better to reuse something if you can, or repurpose it.
Yeah.
So my pithy answer is this: reusing is better than recycling. Recycling is better than refuse. Refuse is better than refusing to let go.
Yes.
So, because sometimes we get caught up in that. Well, it's going to go in a landfill, and it's like, well, you should have thought about that before you bought it.